Can we welcome, please, Charlie Beddoes to the Bub of our stage?
Thank you very much. Nice to see you all. So I am usually a lecturer at a college these days, at a music college, and I teach stuff like cultural theory. And I have to do a disclaimer before I start my lessons, so I thought I'd better do a little bit of a disclaimer tonight. So, content warning, this talk contains sex, drugs and rock and roll. It's got some sad bits and some tragic bits, but it's also got some funny bits. It's okay to laugh, and I'm okay now, don't worry. Okay. So, I'm Charlie, this is my book, Overdriven, that I've just written, which I've come to talk to you about. So I'm talking to you about what it is to be a woman who is overdriven, and what that's meant and where it's taken me throughout the years. So it's the true story of a girl with a dirty bass sound and more ambition than sense. But reading my notes just before, I was thinking maybe I should have called it oversharing. We'll see what you think. But these days it's all about oversharing, isn't it? Like, I probably know more about the Kardashians than I do about my own friends. And even Nick Cave's got in on the act with his red hand files and he's in conversation with. So I think transparency is the new rock and roll mystery kind of thing. So that's my excuse anyway. So why did I write it, you may ask? So it's got lots of sort of anecdotes about famous people in it and stuff, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight. So it's more because there's been loads of situations in my life where I've felt that I haven't had a voice, and here are some of them. So this is kind of my chance to have a voice and tell my side of the story. So there are all these situations I was not heard in, and I've somehow ended up living most of my life in kind of subcultures and countercultures without really meaning to. That's just the way it worked out. I never actually had a proper job, I don't think, in my whole life. Managed to avoid it somehow. And I also thought it was a story people might be interested to hear. And through doing it, I've talked to people about my book, and I've found out lots of people have got stories like this. And so maybe it'll sort of empower people to think that they can tell their weird stories as well. So, this is my mother. She wasn't a very typical woman of her time. This was probably when she was in her early 20s, in the very late 50s or early 60s. And she lived away from home in a bedsit, and she had a job as an accounts clerk, so she was quite sort of progressive and ahead of her time. And she married quite late and had me at 29, and sadly then had a spectacular nervous breakdown, received electroshock therapy, and was never really the same again. So here's a little bit from my book from 1968, when I was 3. So, Mum's crying in her nightie, so I'm crying too. Dad has a suitcase, he's very flustered but determined. It's nearly Christmas, but there's no decorations. Dad says he's going away for a few days and leaves. I don't think he's coming back. Mum sleeps a lot, and I wander around the house by myself. Everywhere is getting dirty. There are lots and lots of milk bottles all along the sideboard, and on the ironing board, they smell of sour milk. Mum scrubs one in the sink until it's shiny like a diamond and puts it on the doorstep for the milkman. The rest stay. So this was actually the start of my mum becoming a hoarder. And the house I grew up in looked something like this. I don't think we had any tins, sorry. Yeah, I mean, now being a hoarder is a thing. It's on reality TV, it's got a name. Back then, it didn't really have a name. I just called it not throwing anything away, basically. So you know that house down the road when you were a kid where there was the overgrown front garden and the mad witch woman lived who ate children? Well, that was my house, basically. And nothing that came into the house ever left, unless its appearance was carefully controlled. Like the milk bottles being polished. So like yogurt pots had to have the pattern scrubbed off before they could be thrown away, and paper had to be torn into equal sized squares. So probably the tidiest place in the house was inside the bin, ironically. And this control of anything that left the house having to appear great extended to me. So this was me putting my best face on. But underneath was this. So, no one talks about the effects on children of the mentally ill on parenting your parent and dealing with their shit from an early age. There's this weird disconnect between consensus reality and the actual reality that you lived in. And I actually thought everyone lived in a house like mine, and I just wondered how they tidied up so quick when I went round unexpectedly. So it took me years to figure that out. But anyway, it led to some interesting coping strategies. So I had these obsessions. I don't know if you remember Ironside, TV detective. I was obsessed with him, and the fairies and Donny Osmond, any of whom I hoped was going to come and rescue me. And I think the other effect that it had on me was it kind of, when you have a difficult upbringing, you don't live in the present like other children, you live in the future and in your fantasies. So it kind of like had this effect of pulling back the catapult really far, so that when I was able to leave home, it was like, it propelled me really far away from my origins. So the first step on that journey was rock and roll saved my life at 16. I got in with a gang of older boys who sort of adopted me like a mascot, and they educated me about all the cool stuff, like Nietzsche and Sartre and drugs and music and politics. And I became a socialist. I wanted to tattoo a hammer and a sickle on my arm, but luckily I was dissuaded. Imagine how stupid I'd feel now. And actually I didn't really identify as a feminist, because in that era, there was still that sort of 60s hangover, where we thought that feminists all had very short hair and dungarees and hated men and were all very angry. So I decided I'd invent being a femininist instead, which meant that I could be equal to men, but I could still look nice. So it was all right. And then I decided, what was I going to do in life? I was going to be a film director. I think I was the furthest thing away. At school in careers, they were like, no, you should get a job in a bank. And I was like, no, I'm going to be a film director. And I got a job at this video company, a production house, recommended ironically by my social worker. And the first thing I ever did, I went along to these auditions, helping out this guy who was my boss. And it was all these little children dressed up in makeup, singing pop songs. And then it turned out that he was friends with a guy called Mike Mansfield, who then took his idea and made it into the mini pops. Do you remember this abomination? Ever heard of that before? Slightly disturbing. And then the next set of auditions I helped out with turned out to be for porn. So this was all really healthy at a young age. So he was basically grooming me. I didn't really know what grooming was until recently, when it was a plot on Coronation Street. But that's what he was actually doing. But it didn't work on me, but it did kill my dream of becoming a film director. So I kind of jacked in my job and went on the dole. And then I took shitloads of acid and had an epiphany and decided, I know, I'm going to be a pop star instead of a film director, because surely the music industry is less sexist. Ironically it is, but that's how bad the film industry is, trust me. So the next step towards becoming a pop star was to run away to Hackney and become a squatter on the dole. In my brain I thought this was the best way to go about it. And so then I started my first band. Don't ask me why it's called that, I have no memory. So this is from 1984. We start a band with Roz called Kicked Income. We believe that all music should be improvised like Throbbing Gristle, because otherwise you're stopping the muse from coming through. We despise pop music because it has had anything real taken out of it, although secretly I like some of it, like Wham and Prince. We have a drum machine playing military beats, and I play bass through a delay pedal making swooping whale noises. Ian hits his guitar with a glass rod through lots of effects, and Roz shouts, "The fascist pigs are coming to get us, and there's something in the water poisoning our minds." So that was my first band. We didn't get a record deal, we didn't become pop stars, but you never knew in those days. This was the early 80s, so, you know, who could tell? And around this time I also became obsessed with Aleister Crowley. I think this was sort of an extension of the fairies, really, just sort of trying to think of ways that I could, you know, do spells to change my life. So I started doing Crowleyan magic and sex magic and stuff like that, and tarot and astrology and the I Ching. If it didn't come out how I wanted, I just did another reading, you know. Eventually it would say something I liked, so it was okay. And I started practicing the bass a lot, which probably had a little bit more value. So at the time, I wanted to be like these bass players. I wanted to be like Barry Adamson from Magazine, or Jean-Jacques Burnel from The Stranglers, Joel Wobble from Public Image, or Tracy Pugh from The Birthday Party. And there were no female role models like this, like bass players who weren't virtuosos, but they were integral to the sound of the band and had their own kind of like flavour about what they did. I wanted to be like that. At the time, you could probably count the number of good female musicians on one hand, and most of them were in girls' school. But I didn't want... Sorry?
Leonard bought my house.
Oh, wow. I once rang up an advert for girls' school, but they said, no, sorry, you're too young. So, which I was at the time, but not now. But yeah, I didn't really want to be in an all-girl band because you don't get judged in the same way. It becomes a bit of a sort of a novelty value kind of thing. So that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I've been trying to rack my brains whether there really are any women comparable to those bass players, and the only one I can think of is Tina Weymouth from Talking Heads from back then. So maybe the spells worked because somehow I met some musicians who could actually play, and they knew all these people at a recording studio, and we started hanging out and writing songs. We only ever did about 3 gigs. We just sort of talked about it a lot and did a lot of bucket bongs, which probably wasn't a good idea, and too much speed, that was the other thing. So this is from 1986. Vince can't get enough of doing speed. We get a gram most weeks. This week we're broke and we really want some, so we take my Watkins copycat tape delay down to Denmark Street and sell it for a £5 so we can buy a gram. When we've done the last line and there's no more left, Vince blows his nose on a slice of sun-blessed white bread to get the last dregs of speed out of his nostrils, and then eats it. Okay, you know, that's what we did in the 80s. Sadly, Space Accident became a space accident, and Vince had a bit of a nervous breakdown on stage, spectacularly. Was found 3 days later in Kensington wearing only his underpants. And we tried to keep Space Accident going with Kevin the Kitten on guitar, but it kind of wasn't the same, so we gave up. So around this time, so here's one for the gear pervs, I bought this BC Rich Bitch 8-string bass that was handmade. It's like a pretty rare vintage bass. And it had octave strings, like a 12-string guitar, so you sounded like Led Zeppelin by yourself. It was amazing. And it has 2 10-watt built-in preamps, so it's a fuzz sound, basically, a dirty fuzz sound. And no one else in this country had that until about 1985, when the Boss Bass Distortion came out in the UK. So I started to develop this kind of unique sound that I'd been wanting to have and kind of get known a little bit for kind of being a bit different to other bass players. So I had a few more bands, but then eventually kind of got a little bit lucky with this band, Rub Ultra. After hundreds of auditions and adverts, stole some people, put this band together. We were kind of like Rage Against the Machine meets the Smashing Pumpkins, and we had the zeitgeist for the first time. And everyone loved us, and there was a massive major record company bidding war. So this is from 1994. One of the companies that are interested is East West Records. We go to their office to meet the head A&R guy who used to play bongos in Haircut 100. He's very enthusiastic and says he loves it because we are girls and guys and black and white. He's bouncing up and down on his chair going, multiracial, multisexual, let's do it. I'm secretly ecstatic and think I am like Malcolm McLaren because the band I got together is shaking up the industry and making rock cool again with all these people who hated it a year ago. And Rub Ultra, we were pretty mental. There was too much spliff involved again. We chose all the people we worked based on their star sign. Here's a little clip of Rub Ultra.
London-based five-piece Rub Ultra describe themselves as testosterone and crackle with a female underbelly. They claim that aliens attend their concerts and tell us that their ambition is to give music liquid roots. Naked City says it was never like this with Jerry and the Pacemakers, probably.
So that was Rub Ultra. Sadly, it didn't last very long, but I temporarily fulfilled my ambition of being sort of known for my distinctive bass sound. And Michael, the bass player from Therapy, said if he died, he was going to leave me his job as bass player in his will. And James Dean Bradfield from the Manics was like, "Oh, you're that girl with that mad bass sound," and things like that. And allegedly, a certain young bass player was influenced by my bass sound on our album, and that was a guy, Chris Wolstenholme from Muse, and he's the reason why all bass players now use effects pedals. So, give me the credit back. It's actually but he'll never admit it, so anyway. But sadly, we split up in Rockfield Studios while we were making a £50,000 album, basically over whose turn it was to make the tea, and also how to mix a Swanee whistle that we'd ill-advisedly put on a track. So yeah, things that you shouldn't do, basically. So then I became a session musician, and that's where I started to have some fun because I didn't have any responsibility. Played with some really well-known people. In my book, I've had to change some of their names for legal reasons. There was a lot of drunken dancing on tables, falling in love with French men on tour, played all the major European festivals and Wembley Arena where this was taken. And I was really happy because I was in my late 30s by then, and I'd been told at 24 that I was too old to get anywhere in the music business, so that showed them. And during that time as well, I met a much younger partner, which is something else I feel I never had a voice about. You know, there's a lot of kind of stigma around an older woman with a younger partner. But he was a brilliant guitarist, and he encouraged me to front my own band for the very first time, which I'd never done before. And we had a succession of bands, it lasted for about 17 years, and we did several bands during that time. So here's a little bit of my stuff that I did more recently in my 40s and early 50s. So although creatively that was probably like the best stuff that I'd done, because I was well into my 40s and then eventually my 50s, even I couldn't break the tradition of, and get a record deal at that age. It's hard enough for a guy, but let alone a woman of that age. And I discovered as well that front women get judged a lot more harshly than I did as a woman, as a bass player. It suddenly becomes about your appearance. I remember doing a gig with the Arctic Monkeys in 2005 and played a bass solo, had effects pedals, moshed, the whole shebang, got a review, says, "Charlie's hair's frizzy, doesn't she know there's product for that?" Oh, Anyway, luckily things are changing a little bit now, but yeah, no one really wanted to listen to some old bird squawking about slugs and snails and being angry. And then, disaster struck, the menopause. So, this is from 2016. I feel like a shriveled husk of my former self, and my personality is warped beyond recognition, and it's like I'm redundant and have no place in the world and am invisible. No one ever explained how it would feel when you have the menopause. You spend your whole adult life in this cycle of hormones and emotions going up and down all the time, like you're linked to nature and the moon and light and other women. But then suddenly you're cut off from it all. It feels like being excluded from humanity. So only humans and 2 types of whale have the menopause on the whole of planet Earth. I believe it's the killer whale and the short-finned pilot whale. And I actually heard a Radio 4 programme about this the other day, and it's believed to be the kind of biological reason for allowing postmenopausal creatures, such as women and these 2 types of whales, to exist, is called the grandmother effect. Apparently, if you've got a male child, its chances of survival increase massively if it's got a postmenopausal mother. Who knew? But I don't have any children, and I ain't no grandma, so what am I going to do with myself? That's what I thought then. So I'll kind of conclude in a minute, but thanks for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed my peculiar story. If you're interested in hearing any of my music and maybe sussing out how some of the more famous people that I've played for, there's my link tree. This is what the kids have, it's a link tree. Links to all your stuff, and my book's on there as well on Amazon. But I'm just going to finish with this bit from 2022. I know everyone says they feel like a teenager inside forever, but it's not just a case of feeling the same. It's like I haven't grown up at all, and I'm still completely driven by angst. But on the outside, I'm turning into an old person. And there are only 2 roles for older women in this world: storyteller and witch. Guess I'll have to be one of them then, or both. Thank you.